Copilot for security and kind of how we position some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So I won't talk too much in terms of background on Copilot for security because by now you're probably all experts. But I did want to kind of set the stage for how some of the skills you'll see talked about and demoed today fit into this broader framework. So one is, Microsoft Entra is the identity provider within Microsoft 365 and Azure and many different Microsoft services. And so now with that, we are also providing some skills specific to Microsoft Entra. And so that is kind of where our focus lies today, as you see there. And so if we dive a little bit into that, how many folks are kind of familiar with what's available today in terms of the Microsoft Entra skills within Copilot for security? Maybe by a show of hands. Okay, I'm seeing at least 4 people. That's good. Okay, so not 5. We got some people who are familiar with this. And when we talk about Microsoft Entra skills, there's kind of some foundational pieces that we wanted to bring in to provide benefits for security teams and IAM teams. One is around prioritization and automation to really drive efficiency, saving time for these different personas. And what we've done to enable that is allow for, say, foundational queries on suspicious sign-ins, high-risk users, getting user details, getting group details. And so we've kind of provided that, and that helps, especially within the context of an incident or other investigation where maybe a SOC analyst or admin is looking at, what users were involved, what was their risk levels, things like that. And we've also seen a lot of really good feedback around some of the summarization capabilities, especially when you look at summarizing a lot of different detections that we have around risk for users, and then bringing in how do we remediate those users, provide recommended guidance for how to troubleshoot or potentially remove those risks from your environment. And then the other piece, on the right side of this slide is around automation of things like lifecycle workflows. So streamlining the process of onboarding new users, a lot of the things that are often very costly in terms of identity management, trying to make that a lot easier for these different teams. So that's what we have today. But one of the things that our team within the Entra engineering group and more broadly, working with other Microsoft security teams saw was that there's this real gap around applications. And so that's what we're going to be investing in and have provided as a private preview that we'll talk about today. As a starting point, we're providing those within the standalone experience. And really, this is an opportunity to get feedback on the types of application service principle related queries that many of you do on a day-to-day basis. And then, thinking about how we might embed those experiences more deeply within places like the Entra portal or the app governance, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps portal, anywhere that you might be reviewing applications. Those are places that we might think about embedding those Copilot skills. And so as an example, you see the user skill here, both within the standalone experience on the left-hand side, and then the embedded experience with the risky user summary on the right-hand side. So we're envisioning that there's some things we could do like that, and I'll show you later on some of the early prototypes that we have of what that might look like for applications. So here's the list of skills that we have available today in Entra and that are publicly available. So you can try these out in your environment. By a show of hands, how many folks have actually tried out some of these skills listed on this slide? Okay, a couple folks. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of different things you can do with this skill set, whether it's just getting the basic details of a user and their sign-ins, their groups, but also getting much deeper when it looks at things like risk and log collection, things like that. So digging in a little bit on the application side, the first poll we have here is a little bit open-ended. I'm curious to learn, what are some of the top challenges or frequent tasks with applications or investigation of application risk that you think generative AI can help with? I'll give folks a few minutes to provide their responses, and we'll see the word cloud show up. Interesting, getting a wide variety here in terms of responses. um, Both looking at kind of users, devices, and then some of the applications pieces, the data that's being accessed, e-discovery, privacy. Very interesting. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of opportunity here, as this word cloud suggests, and some of all of your responses, that we bridge some of the gaps between different pieces of data that we have as Microsoft and that some of our partners have around the risk of applications, devices, users, and how in the context of an environment or more globally how they all come together to uh, provide a more holistic picture of what is the risk for your environment. So there's some really interesting stuff coming in here. So just in the interest of time, we'll move on, but thank you for taking the time to provide your responses here. I'll go through all of them later. So what we hear typically from customers specifically around applications, this includes Microsoft administrators and SOC teams, is, help me secure my app landscape based on known threats. A lot of times I hear there's a big blind spot around applications. Hey, we kind of have users figured out, but applications, workload identities, service principals, we don't really quite have a grip on, what are some of the known threats that I should be aware of here. And we've obviously seen a number of attacks recently that leverage applications. And so this is definitely top of mind for a lot of teams. And then there's the piece about, how do I secure my own tenant, and even just the folks that I do trust, not even malicious actors, but my own developers creating apps. And maybe they don't have the best practices around how to configure identity for their applications. Hackathon projects are a good example. Hey, I'm creating a quick hackathon app. How do I make sure that it's secure by default? And that adds a lot of additional risk when those things are not taken into account. And then there's, applications that have high privilege permissions that leads to high blast radius. This needs to be minimized. And, typically when we're talking to customers and they're assessing the risk of a given application, it is, what permissions are being requested, what permissions have been granted to data within my environment. And so this is a huge concern for many customers. And then some are just stale. There's a lot of stale applications out there. Unlike users, where it's pretty clear that there's a life cycle that needs to be managed, as employees are onboarded and offboarded, applications tend to just exist in perpetuity. And a lot of times it's due to maybe an owner left the company, or the application was created for a hackathon or as a test application, and then it doesn't get cleaned up, and that could leave leave it as additional attack surface for bad actors. And so that's definitely something that we are cognizant of and thinking about as we build some of the prompts. And to Aron's question in the chat, yes, we are built. That is exactly the topic. So it's a great segue. We are going to be building prompts that align to many of these things. So we'll get right into that. So, as I mentioned today, you can have prompts that are specifically around users. So, assisting investigation, troubleshooting around users, like tell me about this security incident, what users were involved, tell me more about the user, is the user risky, the last sign-ins. So those are all valuable. But then, if we talk about applications, there really wasn't anything as of 6 months ago when we started working on this. There wasn't anything around, tell me what apps were involved in the incident. Show me the details for this particular app or service principal. How risky is it? What permissions have been granted? And then how do I reduce the risk? So what we've set out to do is essentially take our first step towards this vision, which is allowing customers like yourselves to ask for more tailored recommendations for prioritized app risk or workload identity risk reduction based on your own policies and the context of your own portfolio. So, what sorts of configurations are you okay with? What sort of risk tolerance do you have? We want to be able to allow customers to fine tune that. As a first step, we're basically taking it as a set of skills that enable admins and SOC teams to manage application service principals registered in Entra ID and investigate them within Copilot for security. And as I mentioned before, we're starting with this open prompting experience within the standalone, and then learning from that to embed it into the portal experiences, ideally where these folks are actually living day to day and doing most of their workflows. So we kind of bucket into three main areas, and I'm curious if this resonates with folks here. There's kind of the identification of risk, especially as we look at that previous slide when we were looking at the entire app portfolio. How do I manage all that risk? Where are my blind spots that I need to be aware of? So reducing time and effort to both proactively assess the risk of my portfolio, and then also reactively, in the case of an incident, find those risky apps within an Entra tenant. And then, understand the risk more deeply. Once you've identified the risk, get more insights about them in terms of the details that we have within the identity platform, some of the specific detections that have triggered on that particular application, and then being able to remediate the risk on those risky apps. Did someone come off mute? I thought I heard a question. Thank you. Did someone have a question they wanted to ask there? Maybe not. I see the comment from Dean in the chat. I would like Copilot for security to help span across all the various security tools. Entra Defender for Cloud, S Defender for Cloud, API Plan. I'm actually less familiar with that one, and Teams apps. Yeah, and this is definitely the direction that we're headed. So, interestingly, we in the Entra team have been kind of the first folks to step into this area as far as like security tools who are building skills for Copilot for security around applications. But we're in active talks with a number of these teams about how do we span across all these different app types. I think Intune has a little bit of that as far as like client applications, but it really doesn't go as far as assessing risk of those applications. So we are thinking about how do we bring in the signals from some of these other security tools to really provide that holistic picture, which is really part of the promise for Copilot for security and generative AI. So now, digging into some of those prompts that Aron was mentioning in the chat. These are some of the ones that we had come up with originally, and I'm curious to get folks' feedback in terms of, which ones are the most valuable to you. And there's a couple different combinations in here, so be aware of that. If you look at like H, I, and J, or especially I and J, where we kind of combine a couple different kind of simpler prompts. So I'm curious, what your opinions are of the most valuable, and you can choose up to 3 here. I see a lot of folks choosing risky apps, service principles. Yep, that's kind of a foundational one. A lot of folks interested in permissions granted to the applications. Yes, as Chris said, 3 can be difficult. The magic number of 3. But it seems like, just based on what I'm seeing in the results so far, just understanding the overall risk of apps or service principals, what permissions have been granted to them, which ones are unused or from outside the tenant. Those are all valuable things. Maybe less so on the, outage risk, kind of resiliency side of things, less on the, credential lifetimes compared to my policies, and even less actually interesting on the last few where it's combining different data sets, which, our hypothesis was that there's a ton of value in looking at some of those last 2 prompts in I and J because it's something that is not easily accessible through, say, the Entra portal or app governance. So it's definitely it's interesting to see that folks really just want some of the more straightforward data on these things, and maybe you could combine them when you put them in sequence, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Yep. Yeah, great point by Dean here about how attackers think. Yep. Yeah, and that's exactly aligned with our thinking in terms of attackers thinking about not how Microsoft bundles are different products or the portals that we use to display information, but really about what are our gaps and seams, what are specific reports that highlight some of those gaps that admins and SOC teams should be aware of. And so that's where we are thinking in terms of the vision for this. And we're taking, a small step forward with some of these individual skills, and the information could be available in places like the Entra portal today. But when you bring them together, it's when it becomes more powerful. And so that kind of leads into what we proposed as kind of an original set of prompts that we wanted to support. Really based on incident learnings, especially large incidents that Microsoft has had and some of our customers that we've worked with, and direct customer feedback. And it kind of buckets into 2 main areas. One is foundational active app threats and app details. So aligned with some of the prompts that you saw on the previous slide about show me risky apps or service principals, we want to make sure that all of the detections that we have and identity protection are able to be used within Copilot to show the riskiest apps, and then be able to get more details both on the app object and the service principal object in the directory, which includes things like which permissions have been granted to a given service principal that might increase the blast radius, and are those potentially high privileged. And then it gets into, what are some of the additional risk factors that we've heard from some of these incident learnings. One big one is applications from outside my tenant, where an app registration is created in an external tenant and the service principal gets provisioned, instantiated within your tenant. That adds a lot of additional risk. Because you don't have the scrutiny on the developer of the application, how it's been configured, and also enables, potentially some lateral movement from attackers into your tenant. And also, unused apps, as we talked about, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. A lot of stale applications that sit around after owners leave the company or don't get used for business purposes. This adds an additional risk, and especially when you think about applications that have been granted high privilege permissions that are also unused or from outside my tenant. So those are things that we kind of thought about as our North Star for our MVP in this app space. And so definitely curious to get some of your feedback on, whether this is the right direction. And so what does that look like tactically? And I'll show you what it looks like in a second within Copilot for Security, but it breaks down into these prompts and specific skills that support those prompts. So we started with kind of 7 simple prompts. And the impetus for that was really that the Copilot for Security platform does not support multiple skills mapping to the same prompt. At least not yet. There's some work being done to enable that, and that will be great. But as of now, you kind of have to break things down and into these simpler prompts, and then it invokes one skill, and you get the response. And so that's where we tried to take this in this kind of building block approach of, show me risky apps, tell me more about these apps, tell me more about these service principals, what permissions have been granted to this app. Which of those are high privilege permissions, show me any unused apps, and which apps are registered outside my tenant. And so this is the initial set. Again, we envision there's kind of 2 ways that we can continue to expand on this. One is adding additional skills in terms of application risks and details that we hear from customers like yourselves. And then the other one is combining them into more kind of pre-cooked insights like you saw on the previous slide, where enabling customers to ask questions like which apps are unused with high privilege permissions, or outside my tenant with high privilege permissions, or trigger risk detections and have high privilege permissions. And then it becomes even more powerful when we refer back to, I think, one of the comments earlier from Dean that said, what other security tools are available to bring in their data. So then we could have skills from them that we bring in and enable responses that would look at the risk that's assessed in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps and the risk that's assessed in identity protection within Entra. That could be something that we would be able to do in the future. So this is the list of skills as they're shown within Copilot for Security in the system capabilities. If you register for the preview, which I'll put a plug in for at the end of this presentation, I know a couple of you already are. There's an opportunity for you to test these out yourself. So let me just cut over to demo for a few minutes. This is probably a good natural pause if there are any questions that you want to make sure get addressed at this point. I'm happy to discuss those now too. So everyone's asking about the recordings. Dennis, if you want to share that as well.
Yeah, I'll share a link at the end of the session.
And I see Dean's comment as well about Entra needs to start enforcing the owner attribute for apps. Definitely interested to learn more here. This is something that at Microsoft we've been doing ourselves, and obviously app ownership is a huge issue, especially when you look at apps that become stale, have permissions that are unused as well, and can increase the attack surface. So we're definitely looking at ways to start enforcing that. If you have specific thoughts on like how we enforce that, whether that's policy driven or something that helps admins actually identify those ownerless apps. Yeah, go ahead, Dean. I see your hands up.
Yeah, so I'm helping a client set up Sentinel yesterday. It needed a app registration. I went in, walked him through it, and I was like, oh, it's a good practice to enter an owner field. But they weren't required to. I mean, it should be pretty simple for that scenario. I mean, and that would be a quick win.
So, and you're talking about specifically the app owner field on the app registration. So any app that's registered in your tenant.
Yep. I mean, we got to start somewhere, and they just set themselves up to not know who created the app. In 6 months when they come back and say, what's this thing for? Oh yeah, the Sentinel team did that, and the Entra guys are like, oh yeah, blah blah blah, and we know who created an Excel file, but we don't know who created an app.
Yeah. Yeah, having that audit log of who created something and then who is responsible for it as well, I think becomes very difficult, especially within this application space. So yeah, that's a great suggestion, Dean.
Yeah, it's been made for years and it's fallen on deaf ears.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting in talking to a lot of customers. There's different ways that owners get assigned. Sometimes folks want to do it within the app registration. Sometimes they want to do it within their own systems. And a lot of times those things get out of sync, and then it's very hard to identify who's the rightful owner of that application. So there is complexity there. It's like we could require it in the platform, when someone's registering an app in Entra, but then if there's another system, we have to make sure those things are also getting updated as well. So having the APIs for that is important. There's a question here about Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, or MDCA. We have app governance. Will Copilot query that data or Azure AD regarding the apps? Great question. So we are working right now with the MDCA team based in Israel to put together that initial set of queries, prompts, and skills that they'll be able to support. We were kind of the first ones within Azure AD or Entra to put together some of these skills that you'll see here. But the idea is that we kind of create that portfolio of different skills that customers can use to query data that is in either app governance or Entra. So that's definitely the direction that we are going. So if you have specific queries that you'd like to support with data that is in app governance or Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, please do share those, and I will make sure that they get to that team as we're building out some of those scenarios. So just jumping into demo here, and I'll continue to look for questions as well in the chat after. So there's kind of a couple things to show just as a starting point. Actually, I'll show you within system capabilities, we have the different skills. So let's do Entra apps. And you can see this is the application skill and the apps outside my tenant. And then if we do Entra service principles, you'll see some of the other ones. And I know a lot of customers like yourselves probably don't necessarily go look for the skills. You just do some of the open prompting, but you can see some of the skills listed here using the system capability. So as a starting point, like basic query of like, show me risky apps. And I won't run a ton of prompts here just because it'll take up a ton of time, but I did do some pre-canned prompting yesterday just to hydrate a session so that we can show some of the skills in action. And then, I'll kind of scroll through that after we get a couple responses here so you can see kind of the breadth of different things that are possible. So show me risky apps. What happens here is we invoke our risky service principles skill, which leverages identity protection data. And, similar to what you would get if you look for risky users, you get kind of a summary of the risk state, risk level, the type of application in this case, so whether it's a service principal application type. And so those will show up here in a second once it finishes processing. Latency is definitely something that we're working on. Most of our skills are pretty snappy. Some of these that generate kind of longer responses can be taking just a little bit longer. And while it's working on that, I will actually put in a different one to give a little details about one of the service principles there, so you can start to see that pop up. And so, yeah, obviously the things that we look to enable here are like, let's identify some of those risky apps within my portfolio. And it's going to only list a subset due to some of the token limitations here. But it'll give you that outline. And then it'll give you the overall set of overall count of service principals. And you can access that using the reference link at the bottom of the response. It'll take you to the identity protection risky workload identities blade to investigate further. And then in this case, like if we wanted to use one of the other skills for service principal details, we could just ask it about one of those service principals, which was Contoso Learning. Here you could use the GUID for the service principal object or the name, and so it gives you a little bit more information. One of the things that we are interested to learn more about is kind of what are some of the properties that you want to see displayed when we get application or service principal details. And so those are things that, we've kind of started with a very small subset, but in the fullness of time and also, balancing the trade-offs of the token limitations, we want to provide value so that you can do further investigations within the Copilot experience, but then also potentially go off and learn more within the enterprise applications page, as is the case here. So then this is the permissions granted skill. So you can see I've also referred to the context of this particular app, Contoso Learning, and asked about which ones are what are the delegated permissions, application permissions, and then also if it had any Entra admin roles assigned to it, which is not really a best practice around service principals, it would show those as well. So I'll just give an example. Using the same permissions granted skill, you could also look at things like, is there any, are there any high privilege permissions for this application? So I'll drop that one in as well. And right now, for this part of the skill, we are looking at specifically a static list of high privilege permissions that Microsoft has identified. But over time, we'll look to expand that, and also I would imagine we'll allow customers to kind of customize what are the high privilege permissions that they see as most concerning, that they would want to be identified in a prompt like this one. So like in this case, this one didn't have any high privilege permissions, but then I could say, what about this other service principal that I heard is high privileged? And so it will refer to that context that I was looking at with permissions granted and high privilege permissions, and it should give me a response there. Oh, great question. There's a couple questions I'm looking at here around permissions granted, different than what we get in Entra permissions management. So yeah, Entra permissions management, my understanding is that they don't look at all the delegated and application permissions. There is a convergence effort happening kind of in parallel to a lot of the Copilot work that you're seeing here to kind of provide a holistic picture of what are high privilege permissions across clouds and across entities like users, applications, and such. And so that's something that actually another person on my team is working on. And so as that convergence efforts happen, we would look to leverage that in the skills here to pull high privilege permissions that you would get in EPM along with what you see today in like the graph delegated and application permissions. Yep. And again, same thing with like the Defender folks. They have their own definitions. So that's definitely the goal, is to bring together high privilege permissions as one definition across these different product areas. I'm just make a note about that too. So yeah, you can see here. This actually interesting. It didn't. You're seeing this is in private preview. This should have actually referred to the high privilege permissions. It instead gave me the application details from the previous one. So I do have another session where it talked about some of the high privilege permissions, so I can show that to you. This is that kind of pre-hydrated session where I did that. So, and again, generative AI, you never know what you're going to get on these live demos. So you get to see the sausages being made. So this is permissions granted to this particular application, none show up. And then, if you look at this other service principal ID. I used the same prompt actually, and it was able to give me those different application permissions, Microsoft Graph user .readwrite.all, and the high privileged Entra admin roles as well, which I mentioned was also in scope for this skill. One of the things I wanted to also show, which is in addition to some of the skills that we've built here that are in private preview, is there's a lot of other skills that you can bring in that would, augment an investigation or, just reviewing your app portfolio. And so that's where I was testing yesterday how this works, and it really does do a good job of, bringing in, audit log details for a particular service principal ID. So say you were investigating one and you wanted to know if there were permissions added to an application, credentials updated, consents for a particular application. Those things would show up in the Entra audit logs for that service principal. And so that's something that you can do here with the audit log skill being used. And then similarly, I'll just scroll down a little bit to lead into some of the other skills that you can use things like our Microsoft Defender for Threat Intelligence skills to learn more about application threats in general. So not necessarily specific to your environment, but as you're thinking about things like unused applications or apps outside the tenant, it gives you a pretty good description of, here are some of the things that you should be aware of when it comes to those risks on your environment. And then you can go about actually querying your environment to get those details. So, as I mentioned before, we have this unused apps skill, which leverages our Entra recommendations for unused apps and looks at data for the last 90 days of sign-ins. And so it'll display kind of a subset of that list and then link you to the page where you can see the full list of applications that are unused. And then the other skill, the outside my tenant, this provides a list of applications that have service principals instantiating your tenant and are registered outside. We've gotten some really good feedback from private preview customers and actually a couple of folks on this call about this skill. Since this is not something that we display in the portal today, there's not like a filter on enterprise applications to display apps outside my tenant. It's an opportunity for us to provide more details on, what does it mean for these apps to be registered outside the tenant? And then how do I actually go get the full list of these applications? Because there isn't a direct, link to that filter within enterprise applications. And so one of the things that we were thinking about here is actually just providing a graph API query that can be used, which we actually use to, underlie the skill. So you can see the query here, the get service principals, and select the apps with organization or app organization ID not equal to your tenant. You could do something similar to get that full list. And then in the fullness of time, one of the things we want to do is learn from, what are the queries that customers like yourselves are putting into Copilot, and that could inform what we put into our portal experiences. That could inform what we put into our APIs and enable. So this might be, one of the examples like that, where if there's a lot of interest and a lot of learnings from incidents recently where we're seeing that apps outside the tenant are a key risk factor, those could be things that we bring into other products after we do some Copilot skills around it. So any questions there just on the demo portion here before I switch back? Seeing some questions about plugins, and thank you, Mamta, for jumping in on some of those. I will switch back to deck. Dennis, if you can just help me pull up the deck again. Noting that it's not showing up for me.
On its way here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Awesome. I'll just take control again. So just a quick overview of some of the things you saw. So we identified some risky apps using identity protection. We did some basic app service principal object details, permissions granted, high privilege permissions granted, looked at another risk factor on unused apps, looked at apps outside the tenant. We also looked at a couple other skills that could augment what you're doing with the new app risk skills from MDTI and from the audit logs and sign-in logs. So just get a quick heat check. I'd love to get you guys to rank what you saw here in terms of the value of some of these specific skills and the prompts they support on question 3 here. And I know this is a little bit duplicative of what we had as I think question 2, but it's more kind of the post reflection after you've seen some of the skills in action. So maybe some of your perspectives have changed after seeing some of them being used. Give folks just another minute to fill out the poll. I was trying to find the results. It wasn't showing up for me immediately, but it looks like it's still show me risky app service principals, which is leading the way, followed fairly closely by high privilege permissions, which makes sense. What permissions have been granted to the app, and then more of the service principal app details, and then unused apps and apps outside my tenant. I am curious, since apps outside my tenant, unused apps are a little bit lower on the ranking here, if there are other risk factors that all of you are considering when it comes to applications. We started with unused apps and apps outside the tenant, but those were just from our own incident learnings and recent conversation with customers. But we may be missing other things. I think ownerless apps was a one that I saw mentioned earlier, enforcing owners. So is it important to have a skill that looks at ownerless apps in general, like we do unused apps? It'd be great if you want to just drop in the chat other areas that you want us to build skills. That would be great as we kind of think about building out this portfolio. External apps with write permissions. Yeah, so essentially kind of what we were talking about with apps outside the tenant with particularly high privilege permissions within your environment. So yeah, that's definitely something that we are thinking about. Oh, Eric, did you want to say something? Oh, he came off mute for a second. Okay, well, we will move along here. So that leads us into another topic. And as I mentioned before, we kind of set out with this original goal to have these pre-cooked insights, which were a combination of different pieces of data that was not readily accessible within the Entra portal. So like Mode mentioned in the chat, you want to look at external apps and you want to look at apps that have specifically high privilege permissions. Those are types of things that we'd want to enable. Fortunately, we can't enable that by itself in one prompt and one skill right now. And we kind of wanted to learn from how different combinations of these pieces of data were being used by customers first. And so the stepping stone to get there was enabling things like prompt books. And so prompt books, I know you had a session previously with Mamta, who's on the call here, and Priyanka as well from the Entra team. And they talked a lot about prompt books, so I won't go in depth on like what is a prompt book, but essentially creating sequences of prompts that can be run end to end within your environment, usually on a regular basis, might help with things like your regular reporting, or it could just save you time in terms of writing out repetitive prompts that you use all the time, maybe save in a notepad. And so that's an opportunity that we saw for our skill set to build out a set of prompt books that use some of these simple skills in combination to identify specifically risky apps, understand what their impact might be, and then eventually, think about the remediation that could take place. And I think this becomes even more powerful when we think about some of the things that a lot of you have said in chat, where we bring in the additional skill sets from Microsoft Defender for cloud apps or app governance, and you can run those types of skills all together to get that holistic risk picture. So what we're asking for feedback on here is, what are the highest value prompt books that we might be, able to make global, available to all customers during our public preview and general availability. So I have a couple options that I'll show you here. They're not necessarily, perfect. They're pretty simple in terms of what we would be trying to do. So if you have additional ideas in terms of prompts that you would consider running repetitively, either with this set of skills or other skills that you're aware of within Copilot for security, definitely let us know that as well. So I'll have a question on that in just a minute. So yeah, just prompt books, kind of how they're structured. So you get your custom prompt books, the ones that are shared within your organization, in this case like Woodgrove, and then global prompt books that are provided by Microsoft and shared with customers. So we're really looking at what is the feedback on which ones we should make global and applicable to all customers in the future. So the first one is about app analysis. And so think about this as, hey, I have a particular app that I want to dig into. Maybe I've identified it during an incident investigation, or I've seen it in another portal and I want to dig more into the details using natural language. And it's, we have a very similar type of prompt book that we've been thinking about for users. So same sort of rules apply in terms of getting things like basic details. Tell me more about this service principal using our service principal detail skill. What permissions have been granted? What could be the blast radius of that particular app? Is it considered risky based on our detections? What are some of the failed sign-ins for this application? Are there changes that have been made that we see in audit logs? And then, maybe tell me more about the global application object, not just the service principal within my tenant. So there's those are kind of like an introductory set of prompts that we could imagine being used for app analysis, but definitely curious if, as you're going through an individual app analysis, what that might look like, other sorts of prompts you might want to ask. So feel free to drop those in the chat and we can, we'll make note of them. This is more kind of along the lines of what we were doing in the demo of looking at the entire app portfolio and saying, where are the risk hotspots? Where should I start my investigation? And so, using prompts like, generate a table of risky apps. So we didn't do that when I was showing you the skill, but you can give it, you can give Copilot some instructions on the output format that you want. And so in this case, like generating a table of risky apps, giving the ID risk state can be helpful. And then getting more details about those applications listed in the table, which ones are, what are their permissions granted, which ones are high privilege permissions. And then, maybe even understanding more about those high privilege permissions. Tell me, what does it mean, using our documentation, which, many folks have said our documentation needs to be better. So this is a good forcing function for us. But, tell me more about those high privilege permissions based on what we've documented on them. And then asking questions like, are any of them outside my tenant? Are any of them unused? Do any of them have no owners? Which again, we don't have a skill for yet, but that could be high value potentially for folks to know. So again, this is looking kind of drilling down from the Uber tenant level down into individual apps to understand their risk. So which of these prompt books is more valuable to you? And you can select A or B, or if you think they're both equally valuable, let us know that. If you think they're kind of valuable, but you would add a lot of things to make it more valuable, let us know that. And if you think like, man, you're like totally off the you're on the wrong track here, I have a much better idea of the type of prompt book you should build, then let us know that as well. Because we're definitely early stages here in terms of building these prompt books. We haven't made any generally available to customers. So it'd be great to get your feedback if you have a sequence of prompts that you think would be valuable for related to applications specifically, but more generally, we have, I know, Momta on the call. If you have another prompt book that's related to users or devices or any other entities, feel free to drop those in too. Seems like a lot of folks think it's most helpful to look at the all-up tenant risk level for applications. But then some folks have actually, well, now it's pulling ahead. It looks like folks are seeing them as equally valuable, or they only want the portfolio level. So that's interesting. So not a lot of folks who are only in the camp of I want to look at an individual app. I guess that makes sense. And no one has new ideas. Even if you answered one of those other ones, I want to get your ideas. So feel free to drop them in the chat as just like a bulleted list if you have a few. So just sharing a little bit of the feedback that we've heard so far from customers. Now that I've kind of presented what we have today and some of the things that we're thinking about with prompt books, it echoes, some of the things that I think I heard originally earlier in the presentation about, we see this as an opportunity to save administrators significant time going across a bunch of different portals, whether that's the Entra portal, Defender for Cloud Apps, App Governance, potentially the Azure portal, just trying to get all that scattered info and tracking down these hundreds of apps and investigating their risk. Copilot is a good way to do that. And then we've also heard a lot of requests, and it aligns with many of the things I've heard today. But definitely call out if there are things that that we're missing here. And I see what Dean said about all my clients need help deciding what to do now. Yeah, so we definitely don't want to add additional work, and that's one of the key principles that we've had here is we're trying to bring together additional or existing data that we have in Entra or in other security portals so that a customer can reason over all that to make their decisions versus create a separate place. And again, that gets back into what we envision with embedding some of this information within the portals so that maybe a customer would not need to go to the Copilot standalone experience, but they'd be able to go within the portal experience that they're using on a day-to-day basis as well. So some of the top requests that we've heard, specifically on like the risky applications skill that I showed you, they want to understand why is this app risky? What is some of the recommended remediation to reduce that risk? So today, we give risk level, risk state, the link to the identity protection portal, but that doesn't always provide the fullest picture of things that need to happen, the detections that triggered for that particular application and what needs to happen in order to remediate the risk. And so we're working with the identity protection team to figure out what's the most transparent we can be in terms of what are those specific detections that inform the risk level, and then what should be done specifically, whether that's remediating specific detections, digging into them, or remediating the app in general. And then I think, as I mentioned before when we were doing the demo, there's a bunch of app details that we could provide. We have on the application object and the service principal object tons of properties, many of which don't get looked at by most customers. And we also have a ton of data about the usage of those applications, the usage of their credentials, the usage of their permissions. But we only want to display the highest value things in Copilot because of a lot of the token limitations and SCU, consumption that happens from pulling all of that data. So figuring out what are those kind of most important app details that need to show up. And then I think we heard a lot about this already, the integration of data from other products, especially Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps App Governance. So that's definitely something that we're actively working on. And then the automated reports and alerting based on some of the app risk insights that you find in Copilot. So whether that's through prompt books that get run as reports or alerts that might show up in tools like Sentinel, these are things that we're interested to get feedback on. What are those repetitive tasks that we can make easier using Copilot? Some with human in the loop, where a human actually clicks a button and says run this prompt book, and others where it's more like, hey, I want this sort of report to be run weekly to give me a sense of my app portfolio risks. And I see Steven's comment here. Just thought this would be long term with the results from application. I think the context of attack graphs can inform the end user what can occur should they leave this stale in nature, similar to how Defender for Cloud has risk exposures. Yes, the application's risk are high, but how can it be exploited? And this can tie into Defender for threat intelligence and what is occurring in the wild. Yeah, we're definitely thinking about how we tie in with more of the context of attack graphs and how maybe an application is a part of them. So it would be definitely interested to learn more, Stephen, on like what you're envisioning there in terms of the how that shows up in Copilot and more broadly. But that's some of the feedback that we've heard as well, is like, I don't want Copilot to just tell me the details of an application, its risk level. I also want it to give me more context on the attack and where the application was involved, the remediation that needs to happen as part of that. And so those are the types of things that we want to get to in the future, and we're just kind of taking stepping stones here. So here's some of the kind of immediate roadmap, and I give the disclaimer, this is very subject to change because we're only in private preview and we're getting a lot of feedback from customers as we speak. But there's kind of the basic pieces that we want to do around enabling prompt books, like you saw, ensuring that all of our skills can be used in sequence, both with a singular input, like looking at a singular app, or multiple inputs where you're looking at all of my risky apps and I want to get details about them. And then allowing admins to invoke those skills from the Entra portal, which I'll show you in a second, some of those early thoughts of what we're looking at there. And then, based on some of the feedback that we've heard from customers, we're looking at potentially adding additional skills around overprivileged permissions, so unused or reducible permissions. Right now, like with unused apps, we have a Entra recommendation that's in private preview. So taking that data that we have in the Entra recommendations, bringing that into Copilot to ask questions like, which of my apps are overprivileged, which of my apps are unused and overprivileged. Those would be the types of things that we could enable with this new skill. Getting more information on, why the app is risky and what to do about it. This is similar to what we have today in the risky user summary. So essentially doing what we do for users, trying to do something very similar for applications and service principals. And then getting to that place where we have more complex prompts, kind of pre-cooked insights. So as I said, we went with kind of a simpler approach of, or not simpler approach, but more kind of simple prompts of building blocks that we wanted to see how customers combined. But then we could also build them out into individual skills. So if there's like one risk factor that becomes very clear that customers are interested in, like apps outside my tenant with high privilege permissions to graph, that could be something that we build into its own skill. but we want to see how the individual building blocks get combined before we go that far. And then, getting the generative AI inline consent recommendations. This was an area that, as we were doing the initial investigations for this, Copilot investment, we heard a lot of feedback that customers really struggle with coming to consent decisions about applications. Today we have the admin consent workflow experience that some customers are using. A lot of them have their own kind of consent review tools or workflows that they do. We have the consent dialogue that pops up, but a lot of times there's not enough information to really make a strong recommendation on this app should be consented to or not. We're bringing some details in with permissions, classifications, and things like that, especially within the admin consent workflow. But we see an opportunity with generative AI to really provide a more holistic picture of, what is the risk of this application? Should it be something that you consent to? And actually making a strong recommendation to an admin that say, yeah, you should consent to this, or no, you should investigate this application before going further. And so that's something that I'll show you in just a second what we were thinking about with that, but it's definitely an area that we've heard a lot of feedback on. So yeah, the two kind of embedded portal experiences that we are thinking about here. One is the apps overview or enterprise apps, where we would surface insights and then allow admins using the sidecar within the portal to ask further questions about those insights. And then the other one is within the admin consent workflow that I just mentioned. And I know folks might have to drop off because of being at the top of the hour. It's late there. Totally understand. And hopefully you'll be able to catch the recording and some of the demos at the end here with follow-up discussion. So I will pull up these prototypes for folks to see. So this is the enterprise apps prototype that we're looking at, the first one on that slide that I showed you. So as I mentioned, we're kind of looking at where are those pre-cooked insights that we could service for admins. And so as we learn from Copilot for security and what prompts are being used, we might say, hey, these are some real insights that admins really want to see surfaced within their enterprise apps experience, or anytime they're really could be anywhere that they're reviewing applications, including, app governance or other portals. And so by having these insights surfaced, it would kind of spark that interest to say, oh, I have these 11 unused apps that are high privilege. Let me go summarize them with Copilot. And so then it provides the response of, okay, you have these 11 unused apps. They have these permissions. And so then what's the next step? Like, I want to learn more about those apps. And so they can start digging into it. And this is where the interaction between Copilot and the portal itself becomes interesting, because it can say, show me those apps. It'll actually filter the enterprise apps experience to show just those applications that are unused with high privilege permissions. And then you could go the step further and say, I want to view this particular app and get more details about it. So then it would go in and say, okay, here's some of the basic details about it. Yes, you could click on the app itself and get some of those details, but this allows for the additional digging into it and doing some of the things like remediation. And so, like, how can I reduce risk for this application? Here's the recommendation from Copilot, do this. And then, okay, what are those high privilege permissions that I might need to reduce? Okay, they're listed there using that high privilege permission skill that I showed you before. And then ultimately, it's like, do I generate a script or take you to the portal to actually go remediate that issue? So it's kind of a guided app risk experience is the way to think about it. I'm curious to get folks' feedback on if this would be useful to them. The other one that I mentioned that we're looking at is this consent recommendation. This is a little bit of a shorter demo, but essentially within the admin consent workflow, when you've been reviewing requested permissions and about to make a decision on whether you consent to this app, you'd say generate a recommendation, and it would give you the thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down on whether you should consent to this app. And then it provides a short explanation based on the data that we have. And then ideally, you'd be able to open the chat with Copilot if you wanted to ask specific questions like you saw in the previous prototype of, what are those high privilege permissions, what risk detections might have been triggered with it, those sorts of things. So does the guided app risk experience include threat intel? So not today. I mean, the experience doesn't exist today at all, but that would be the idea, is that you could bring in threat intel as one of the skills, one of the maybe the suggested prompts that would show up as you're going through that guided experience. So I think we would work on ensuring that we have the right list of prompts that would provide that holistic picture for an admin as they're going through that guided experience. So Dennis, if you want to just switch back to slides. Perfect. Yeah. And I see, Dean, your other comment here about the prompt book idea. I would agree that is definitely a I think low-hanging fruit to provide just an accurate list of apps across all those different places where you can have applications. Yeah. Oh yeah, and Stephen, your comment as well about the consent recommendation. Yeah, that has been one of the top pieces of feedback, because people just really don't understand our permissions consent model, the scope of different roles, and how that should impact your decisions on an application being consented to. So it's definitely the direction. So I showed you the consent recommendation experience. This is just a little bit more. One thing, one open question I had here, and feel free to drop it in chat, Stephen or others, is would it make sense for Copilot to recommend a particular consent policy be implemented? So obviously there's the enterprise apps experience where the apps are already instantiated in your environment. You have to go remediate them or configure their permissions. But in this case, you're not, these apps are seeking consent within your environment. So would it make sense to recommend to admins, hey, configure this policy that would reduce the overhead of some of these reviews in the future? So say a policy that looks at, only low privilege, only apps from inside your organization, registered in your organization and with low risk permissions. That's what you should configure as your consent policy because of the things that we have observed within your tenant. Yeah. Yeah, great. Great, Stephen. And yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah. Yeah, implications is another thing that we're thinking about. And that's I think, all the skills, as we move down this path towards letting Copilot do more automation, is like not just enabling Copilot to recommend the solution, keep human in the loop on making that decision, but assessing the impact if that decision is made either by Copilot or by the human. That was one of the things that we looked at too, is in the app space. So if an admin is to remove certain permissions from an application, or update a credential type, or disable an application entirely, what's going to happen to the business processes because of that decision. And that, we don't have all that data today to inform Copilot, but that's definitely the direction we would hope to go, so that you really get that end-to-end experience. So, quick question here. How valuable would this scenario be? The apps overview one in enterprise apps, the guided risk experience. How valuable would that be to your organization? Yeah, Dean, that's an interesting question. Do I need to update my resume before I do something? Would anyone trust Copilot to answer that question? I don't know. Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. Maybe someday. Looking at results for this one. Yeah, so about 4.3. So most people see this as pretty valuable, and I think the feedback that's been shared about bringing in some of the threat intel info, that could be a really good add to that experience. So same question for the app consent workflow. Dennis, are you seeing the results on that one from your end?
Yeah, so far this one's coming in just slightly lower
Okay.
than apps overview, so we're at about 4.0 right now.
Okay, so generally people see these as valuable, with the guided apps overview experience being a little bit higher. Yeah, and any additional feedback on things you'd like to see there, be great. We're going to include these experiences within a round of deeper dive interviews that we're doing with private preview customers. So another plug here that I'll put again at the end here in a minute about private preview. If you'd like to participate and try out some of these skills, we're planning to not just get feedback on the standalone experience that we have the skills available for today, but also get more in-depth conversations on some of these specific embedded experience that could be even more useful. Okay, so I know we're getting close to time. So I'll kind of finish with at least the main content with one of the more open-ended questions. What other use cases can you see Copilot helping with? Maybe, as Chris said, as an advisor, helping admins make quicker decisions. What sorts of decisions do you want to have it help make, especially when it comes to applications? Clients. I used to work in the compliance space, and when I see compliance, I think of so many different things. There's compliance with different regulations. There's compliance with your own environment's policies. So, yeah, if there's any additional details on what sorts of compliance are we talking about? I see a lot of things popping up here about governance as well. App performance. Okay. Yeah.
I kind of put in about the compliance aspect. I'm thinking about things like that you would normally get from Defender for Cloud Apps. You know, like when you do a discovery and you want to see if the data residency on that application is right, or if it's got its certificates, or if it's a sanctioned vendor or not. You know, it's that kind of because obviously you've got that indirectly impacts the app's risk. I mean, you've got like, I guess the narrow risk of things like permissions and over being permissioned for it, but it's also risky in terms of from a compliance aspect. If you know you've got apps in your environment that people are just installing without any thought of the data residency, here in the UK, kind of well known that some organisations want or need the data residency to be here in the UK because they don't want to abide by FedRAMP if the apps in the US, for example. So if it can bring that in and get some of the things that are done through Defender for Cloud Apps, I think that would be great too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's data we already have available within the Cloud Apps catalog. Mapped to different regulations. Yeah, sanctioned, unsanctioned. Yeah, I think seems like a pretty easy one for us to look at. I am curious too, kind of on the flip side of, being able to ask if an app is in compliance with the tenant's policy. So, say there's a credential policy in place that says apps shouldn't have secrets. They should have certificates or managed services identity. Should that be something that could also be queried in Copilot as well?
I think so. I mean, I kind of looking at this as these things develop, and the apps in specifically, I kind of seem to be split across very many teams in Microsoft. So while I'm working with it in the CCP, is that I talk about apps in terms of the Intune and the management group, because they manage apps through Intune. I'm talking about them in security and the CCP through Defender for Cloud Apps, and I'm talking about access and authentication, through Entra. There could be a case, for example, for convergence of some of these things. You would look at something like Copilot for Entra. If it's taken about apps to kind of access the other components, so that this is the Copilot for apps all up, as it were, or through Copilot for Entra can access all this other information that's about you. Want to kind of, if I'm going to sit there in front of a customer or partner and say, look, this is going to be your kind of advisor to advise on the apps inside your environment. If it's just about access and authentication and permissions and stuff, or the domain of which kind of Entra is, I think it would be far more effective to say, look, this Copilot for Entra is about apps, but through that you can have everything you need to know about the app use within inside your environment. I think that's going to make it a lot more powerful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, we don't want to add a new Copilot to the portfolio, but even just, could you go to Copilot for security and just have a set of prompts or a prompt book that you could run that gives you that picture of your environment as far as all those different types of apps. And I think I saw earlier about Entra, Teams, Intune, Defender for Cloud Apps. There's so many different places that apps are assessed and inventoried, and so I think we could look at how do we bring that together. Makes a lot of sense. Just looking at some of the other responses here, change management is another interesting one. I'm interested to know, what in change management, since it's such a broad term, you're thinking about, like, is that, how do I go about implementing certain policies or procedures with applications? I don't know who put that one in, but that's an interesting one. Weak authentication as well. that makes sense.
Hey, Ari, we're just approaching time here, so we may
Yeah.
want to just jump to cover the private preview stuff before we have to close out. But certainly, if folks do have additional context for some of those items, feel free to drop them in the chat as well.
Sure. Thanks for the time check. Yeah. So call to action here. So we entered our private preview at the end of June. As I said, some of the folks on this call have been a part of that and been providing great feedback, testing out the skills. So definitely interested to expand that group. We're at this stage now, about a month and almost a half, and about a month in actually, where we've gotten some good feedback, but we definitely want more folks testing it out. And seeing if there are areas that we're missing, especially blockers to adoption before we go to public preview. So see this as a good opportunity to get you onboarded. It's just a pretty quick sign up form that you see on the slide here. We can pop it in the chat. The only requirements are that you have SCUs, which I think most of you do. The roles that are necessary to run some of these skills and access the underlying data are like either global admin, app admin, cloud app admin, anyone who can access the application data within an environment. So shouldn't come as too much of a surprise there to make use of these application skills. But those are some of the things that we're looking for. And we run regular office hours with myself and others on the product group to get questions and blockers addressed. And as I mentioned before, we have this opportunity to do some deeper dive interviews, especially when it comes to that embedded experience of like, where would we want to bring these skills in the future? So these are just some of the requirements that I just mentioned. We're definitely looking for folks who are, as number 4 mentions, willing to provide feedback and do some of the testing. I know this is a tough time over the summer where people are taking vacations and have other things that they got to do. So totally understand if you don't have the time for it at this point, but we're hoping we get enough good feedback to enable us to move to the public preview stage and get this available to all customers who are interested, and continue to work, as we mentioned before, continue to work with other teams within Microsoft to provide a more comprehensive skill set when it comes to applications. So the quick heat check, how many folks are likely to sign up for private preview? Filling out this question does not commit you to signing up for it, but I was just curious, after the presentation, how did I do? Did I convince you to maybe try these things out with us and provide feedback? Always looking forward to it. Okay, so I think we're trending towards likely, moderately likely, or very likely. So that's good. So thanks, folks, for joining and the active conversation on chat, and those who came off mute to share their feedback as well. We really appreciate it. Added my LinkedIn